Great to be with you. Hey, you can go ahead and grab your seat. If we've not met, my name is Ryan. We're absolutely thrilled to have you join us today. Hey, a couple things that are exciting that I want to tell you about. First, Glenn Ransom, who's on our staff, he oversees worship and production. He and his wife, Brittany, they had their first baby this week. Yeah! So exciting. Sweet baby Rose was born on Friday. Continue to pray for them as we're thrilled for them. And then our worship team, they're fantastic, and our setup and teardown teams, you just need to know this. Sometimes we run into some things where we normally set up on Saturday mornings. Last night, the team couldn't get in until 9 p.m. last night. Yeah. They came, set up, our worship crew, and set up and tear down team. And can we just thank them for all they're doing? That's unbelievable. They've been experiencing technical difficulty, and they have done just such a great job leading us through that. Now, we're in a series called Still Wondering. We're wrestling with some of life's biggest questions. And one of the things that I'm grateful for this series is I get to bring in some people who have deeply shaped me that I have learned from over the course of my life and get to share them with you. Today, I have the joy of having Dan Kimball. He's got his doctorate. Yeah, some of you know him. He's fantastic. He's a pastor. He's an author. He's a professor. He is shaping, so many of our people like Glenn and Molly and others have gone through seminary under Dan's oversight there of what he's led. But quite literally, the thing is, Dan was my youth pastor and college pastor, and has formed and shaped my understanding of ministry. Was the first person inviting me into actually to work on a church and serve. He taught me how to, the nuts and bolts of preaching, all the other things. Awakening wouldn't exist without his mentorship, leadership, and deeply grateful for him. And so would you give a warm Awakening welcome to Dan?
And as when you have guest speakers that come in, and they always say, I'm glad to be here. I really am glad to be here. It's like an honor to come. This is the third time I've been here, because I have such great respect for Ryan. Just knowing him, as you mentioned, I think he was 14 or 13 when I met him first. Watched him grow up through the teenage years. He and Jenny weren't dating when I was youth leader. That happened later, but I can remember both of them as teenagers, and then just the joy of seeing them serving Jesus after all of these years, and the influence they've had with all of you. And just the joy of, with Glenn, he's got the baby because he's in the cohort, Molly, Megan, I just saw Haley, who used to be an intern at our church in Santa Cruz. So I feel very comfortable being here with you, and it's a joy to be here. So, as Ryan said, you're in a series that is, called Still Wondering, Life's Biggest Questions. And I'm really so happy that you're doing this series, because we can't avoid the tough questions of today. It's we just, if you're a Christian, or perhaps in this room you're exploring faith, and that's why you're here, wrestling and talking about the tough questions is really, really important, more so than ever, and I'll explain why. But the question we're going to be looking at today is Jesus really the only way to God, or just one path among many? I can say this because I've surveyed so many, especially in their 20s, and this generally, after kind of the sexuality questions, this is generally the second biggest question that comes up, and more confusion about this even from especially younger Christians, because we live in such a culture where there's so many different beliefs, and this question actually was the one that propelled me into wanting to know more about Christianity. I was not raised a Christian, and I'm going to first just tell a little bit of the story of it, and then this morning, just a little in advance, it's going to be a little more like a class. So I'm going to be giving more information, a little bit more, and walking you through some things than maybe a typical rallying, big kind of preaching thing. It's going to be a little more like a classroom, because this is really important to understand in our minds and then in our hearts too, because it's such a critical, even sensitive question. So is Jesus really the only way to God, or one path among many? For me, I'd started at Colorado State University, where I grew up in New Jersey, right near New York City, went away to college, wasn't thinking about God too much, just I never thought there wasn't God, but I never thought about it too much. I then, like the first or second day of school, they have all the campus clubs, and they put out all the tables. And I'm walking by one table, and there's I can still remember, it was next to the square dancing club. Because I'm like, oh, there's a square dancing club. Like, they don't have those in New Jersey. And so I'm out there like, square dancing. And then next was some Christian club. I'm like, oh, a Christian club. And I'm looking, there's a girl behind the table. And then they had brochures. I'm like, oh, I'll pick one of these things up. And so I picked up the little brochure, and it was something like one of these. It said something like, Jesus the only way, or some one way to God. It was something like that. And I walked over to, that photo I had up was actually the place. It was the courtyard at Colorado State University where they'd set up all the tables, and I sat down on a planter. It was that vivid of a memory. And I remember looking at this thing, and I remember, Jesus the only way? And I open it up, and I'm reading Bible verses. Now, I don't recall which verses for sure, but I'm pretty certain these would be the verses that would be in these pamphlets. And I'm sitting there reading this, and I'm reading John chapter 14, verse 6. And it says, Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. And I'll be like, oh, that's good. And then all of a sudden, then he says, no one comes to the Father except through me. I'm like, boy, that's a pretty strong statement to make. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5 and 6, it says, for there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all people. Now, it doesn't say anything about there's multiple mediators, or there could be different gods, or it's one person between God and people, and that's Jesus. In Acts chapter 4:12, it says, salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. Now think of that statement. And again, I have such vivid, it was kind of like a God moment. I'm like, well, what about, and I remember the movie Gandhi had just come out, recently, whatever year that was, and I'm like, what about Gandhi? Or what about, Islam? And what about Buddha? What is this saying when it says salvation is found in no one else? There's no other name under heaven, that's everywhere, given to mankind by which we must be saved. And then even the words of Jesus himself, the words of John, one of the followers of Jesus himself, whoever has the Son, talking about Jesus, has life. Okay, whoever does not have the Son of God does not have life. And those, if you just, as you're reading them and thinking about them, these aren't casual sort of statements. These are statements that are saying there is God, and there is one way, one person, no other name or person under heaven anywhere is the way we understand and are saved and know God is through Jesus. And that really kind of caught me off guard, and I hadn't thought about it before, but I'm like, oh my goodness, what about all these other religions? Is this what Christians really believe? Very clearly, just from those verses, in the Christian scriptures, we see God communicating that there is only one way, not just to know, but to experience salvation, forgiveness, and peace with God, and that is through faith in Jesus and what he did on the cross. Now, I'm sitting there in Colorado State University, 19 years old, whatever I was, and I'm looking over at that girl behind the table, and it's the thought of, right, she's giving out Christian pamphlets here in the suburbs of northern Colorado, predominantly Christian, and especially in the 80s, and I'm like, well, what if that girl was raised in India? And her family happened to be either Hindu or Muslim, depending on where she lived in India. Wouldn't she be at the table giving out tracts about Hinduism? What if she grew up in China and she was then, her family was Buddhist, and wouldn't she be at the university Buddhist table at the club giving out Buddhist information? Like, isn't it pretty arrogant and pretty almost like crazy to be thinking this girl's giving out these tracts, that she's right and all of these other people are wrong? And wasn't it just because she happened to be in suburban America why she adopted the beliefs of probably her family and what suburban America was believing? You see, we're in a world where we are now more aware, and so many things have accelerated to today from when I went to college, especially being in the Silicon Valley with so many diversity of beliefs and everything. But now we're all the more aware of other people's beliefs. We're now all the more aware of opinions and global faiths. There's church buildings that have been turned into mosques. I mean, it's all over, especially here in the Bay Area. And how can then this be true? Isn't it understandably, like, if I'm just a person hearing these claims, isn't it just going to be natural to almost, boy, that's a very unloving, judgmental, and even arrogant thing to claim that? Now, if you go online, and when I was doing some research a few years ago, I found a ton of memes, and there's a lot of now TikTok videos that do the same exact thing, but there's much discussion out there once you start paying attention, if you don't hear it, where it's like, yours is the one true religion. Tell me again, what's wrong with the other 4,199 religions of the world? Or this other one, there are almost 5,000 gods being worshipped in humanity, but don't worry, only yours is right. Right? Like, that's our world. These are actually good questions. If you're a Christian and you're active in with Christian friends, sometimes we forget, like, this is the reality of looking in on us. And when I first was exploring faith, I can remember I was buying some Bibles and some Christian books, I'm like, is this true? Because I couldn't shake it out of my head. My friends actually had a time with me, and one of them even said, Dan, we're worried about you. This Christianity is a cult. And I can remember them saying that and thinking also, people in cults don't realize they're in cults, right? And my friends were concerned about me, right? And I'm like, I don't want to join no cult, right? And so for me, it propelled me to dive deeper and think through this more, because I had no parents that were saying, you should be a Christian, or friends, you should go to the youth group, or there's none of that. It was me in Colorado State wondering if this is true, and actually a little disturbed emotionally at the time, thinking that Christians really are claiming this. So what I want to do now is walk you through the process that I went through. And again, it's a lot of information, and to have us think through this, because it's easy just to hear different verses and like, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, I believe it, and not consider, why do we believe that? How do we explain this to someone? If you're in this room and you're not a Christian, it's a really good question to be asking, like, why does this group think that they're the true ones? And it's not just this group, it's the actual scripture. So we'll get to this. And before we do, I want to turn to a pop culture icon of wisdom and intelligence, and I won't comment on this, but it's like with Madonna, she has a few words that, and I think she represents today's pop culture and cultural. I do believe that all paths lead to God. It's a shame that we end up having religious wars because so many of the messages are the same, right? Now, I read that, and if I was just Dan in Colorado State, I'd be like, that's right, that's how I feel too. Like, it's a natural thing to almost like, all paths somehow lead to God. Like, yes, the Gandhi movie was out, and like, oh, there's that group, and there's this group, and like, it's kind of weird that you would fight about it. All paths lead, and I think it's all about like love people, right, and all that stuff. So what I want to do is examine this to say, is Madonna right? Do all paths lead to God? Let's look at this a little more deeply. So, do all paths lead to God? Now, here's a big thing to understand if you don't. It is true that there are very similar teachings amongst different world religions. This is where it often gets confusing, because there are truths in every single world religion. There's good teachings in every single world religion. And even if you look at it from a viewpoint, and you'll hear things like, this is it's called the Golden Rule. Like there's if you were to go into the United Nations building in New York City, I remember you go in the lobby, and there's this big mural out of mosaic, and it's based on a Norman Rockwell painting that he did in 1961, and this was like in the 80s, I think they put it in. But it's the Golden Rule, and there's people from all over the world and all different faiths, and it says we all believe the same thing. And if you look at this poster, and this is a common poster, and it's common what you see, is like there's the Golden Rule, and you'll see all the teachings, basically all the different world faiths, it's pretty much all the same. And Christianity, when you look at this one, they quote Matthew chapter 7, verses 12, which is the Golden Rule. In everything, do to others what you would want, what you would have them do to you. That's right. That's the teachings of Jesus. And then you look at Hinduism and their sacred texts. And you will see in their sacred texts, do not do to others what would cause you pain if done to you. That sounds similar. In Buddhism, treat not others in the ways that you yourself would find, there's a typo there, hurtful. And there's I've read a whole book on parallel sayings between Jesus and Buddha, indicating like, no, it's all the same. It all ends up in the same place. You know, in Islam, here's another one, not one of you truly believes until you wish for others what you wish for yourself. So again, I see that. Look, they pretty much are saying the same thing. I will now turn to another pop culture icon of Oprah Winfrey, and she says, there are many ways, many paths to what you call God. There couldn't possibly be one way. All right, now again, if that's true, it's like, hey, everything's cool. Like, I don't got no conflict. I follow Jesus, you follow Muhammad's writings and Allah, like, you know, you're Hindu, we're all the same, we're all, you know, there's many paths, we just are on a different path, right? However, if you look at this, like this is the thought of what pop culture generally will be saying today, and just culture in general. If you look at, there's God on the top of the mountain. And so it's a nice thought, as Oprah and others say, like many paths lead to God. So just picking out three. There's Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam, and they all end up at the mountaintop, and there's God. Same paths, different paths, same ending. It sounds very nice, again, no conflict, easy to say, but is this true? This is what I want to, this is again in my head, I'm trying to play out, is this true? Like, how does this work? Do all paths lead to God? So let's explore it just a little bit. Now, at the base level, there may be similarities amongst world religions. Just like I showed you the Golden Rule, there are similar statements and teachings that have the same basically goal in what they're trying to say in these different world faiths. So at a base level, when you're kind of surface exploring and getting into a little bit of it, they do seem similar. Right? There's commonalities that they may have. Many of them will say, take care of the poor, right? Like, oh, so there's things that like, I agree, we're all the same. However, and I've talked to enough people, and most, not all, but most don't take this next step. Why don't you explore a little bit beyond the surface, and let's go up the mountain of each one further to see if they're taking you to the same place. So if we go up beyond the base level, and I'm just going to, again, focus on these three, and I'm giving a very oversimplified summary of some of these faiths because it could take an hour each one to even go through. But if you go beyond the surface level, the base camp, up the mountain, let's look at Hinduism. So at Hinduism, if you go up, there's a sense, it's hard to even describe, there's a supreme being, a formless God, but they have many gods and goddesses. It's actually called henotheism, which means worshiping. There is a understanding of some sort of one being, but there's actual literal other gods that you can pray to and all these other things. So there's many gods. Jesus was seen as a yogi, a divine teacher. He was enlightened. They even say he was a holy man, but he didn't die on the cross, resurrected, payment for sin, and these things. They also believe, like, when you die, there's reincarnation. So all of these, that's the mountaintop there brings you to that set of beliefs. Then if you go to the mountain of Islam, you will then find that there's clearly one God in that one, not many gods, that's like absolute. In understanding the walk and the life of someone in Islam, there's adherence to the 5 pillars for salvation. There's not a savior needed. It is based on like what we do in this life for the final judgment. Jesus would be a human messenger, a prophet, but he's not the Son of God. So when you get to the mountaintop of Islam, when you start looking at the single God and salvation, who Jesus is, very, very, very distinct, and that's what you get there. Then you go down to, say, Christianity. When you go up that path beyond the commonalities that there might be with other world faiths, you then find that the God at this mountaintop is a triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, not 3 different gods, one God in 3 persons. You will then see that salvation is in this person of Jesus, who is God in flesh, who came to this world. He went to the cross. He died, paid a price for sin, people's faith. He rose again from the dead. Our eternal salvation and relationship with God is based on our faith in him. It's a grace-based, not effort-based faith. And when you get up to that mountaintop, Jesus is the Son of God, one true God. Salvation is through Jesus. So I get to these mountaintops, and when you do explore each faith more deeply, the paths lead to entirely different mountaintops. Like, again, if Madonna and Oprah were sitting right here, I'd be like, Madonna, like, I'm trying to understand how you say that. Or like, Oprah, how do you understand this when you're saying that? Because they don't lead to the same mountaintop. Like, that's actually incorrect. In fact, the mountaintops, when you explore each of these faiths, not only like they're different mountaintops, they're like opposing mountaintops. They're actually, when you look into it, they're then pretty much claiming that the other, which you don't hear about a lot, the other mountaintops are wrong, because most of them claim this is the actual truth, and then these other ones would then be wrong. And so they're totally opposition in terms of even basic fundamental beliefs about who is God or how is someone have peace with God. They're entirely different. And then if you were to say, well, that's God, God would then be lying. He'd be kind of like schizophrenic, lying, confusing people, which then goes against what he says, because it always says God is a God of truth. So therefore, if he's telling one people group, here's who I am, another group of people, here's who I am, then he's like a crazy, schizophrenic, lying God. It wouldn't make any sense, because they're in opposition views. He'd be basically calling himself a false teacher, because that's what he says false teaching is. So here's the conclusion of this. When you get to these mountaintops, the reality is either one is right and the others are wrong, or none of them are right and something else is true. Right? When you really examine these faiths, as nice as the sentiment is, well, they all lead to the same God. Doesn't matter what path you're on, you get to the same place. When you look at it, it's not true. That's a false statement. And so then for me, at that time, when I was exploring this, and for anyone here if you're exploring it, or even a Christian, say, like, why do I believe this? What we then have to decide is which of the communications that these various religious faiths give us is the right one to then believe. And what I can say is, for me, that was the primary thing that I focused on. Because then if a God is claiming to be giving truth through sacred texts of some sort, I want to be testing those texts, those writings, to see which one is right. And for me, when I started looking into the scriptures, and then you learn the manuscript reliability, the archaeological backing, the eternal consistencies, and a big one for me, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, it's also the prophecies that came true, and just comparing the scriptures to other sacred writings out there, I can just say this stands the test. And I'd be happy to talk to anyone ever about like why I then just felt, and many others, that the other texts that claim to be from God don't have the credibility that the scriptures have. And Ryan talked about this a few weeks ago, and if you weren't here for the sermon that was, Can You Really Trust the Bible? Please go back and watch that and listen to that. If you want to read more about this, there's a thick book, a long book by Craig Blomberg called Can We Still Believe the Bible? And there's a little short book called Can I Really Trust the Bible? And to read more, because it's really important, I believe, that if you're a believer or you're searching like I was, having trust in the scriptures as our source of truth was really important. Because then, when we see verses, when we see truth, what it says, I'm then going to hold that as what God is really saying. So, when we then see these verses that I read earlier that are claiming there's one way to God, right? If it's really from God then, it's not arrogant or unloving to believe that something is true, and I have another little typo here, if it is really true, right? If it's not arrogance to say there's one God and one way to that God, if that's really true. It may mean believing something isn't true then, but that's not arrogance or unloving, it's just believing in truth. So for myself, I got to a point where I ended up believing the scriptures are credible and how God was communicating to us. And when I learned that Jesus is, those verses that I read, clearly claiming he's the way, the truth, and the life, and I put my faith in what he did on the cross and believed that he rose again for the dead as a payment for my sin, and by faith I received the grace of forgiveness through Jesus. And then it's like, all right, but then if that's true, where did all these other religions come from? Because we're seeing something, even these verses, all right, it's true, but then I'm seeing these verses, where do those verses fit in the context? Why do we just quote them? Because there's something that we miss sometimes if we're just quoting them without understanding how we got there. So I want to spend a few moments talking about why is there so many other religions? Like, where did all these come from? How do we get to where in the Silicon Valley today there's all different kinds of beliefs? So I was just reading last night, I was trying to look up some statistics. There's it said the fastest growing belief system in the Silicon Valley, it said, this one source, if it's accurate, it said was, I'm forgetting, some sort of Buddhism, but not religious Buddhism. There was a term it used, and I should have wrote it down. I did somewhere, but anyway. So like, where did these come from? So let's take a look at this, and to know, we want to go back to the beginning of the grand story. So if we go back to the beginning and say there was a God, and God created everything in human beings. So therefore, if you look into the scriptures that we believe is from God, it then says, in the beginning, God created. So there is one God in the beginning. So in the beginning, people worshiped one God. Now, this is backed up by the New Testament in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5. it'll say, for there is one God. Over and over and over through the Old Testament and the New Testament, it just says over and over and over, one God, one God, one God. There's like no confusion about that. Now, when you look at a secular resource, there's a woman named Karen Armstrong who's extremely popular, and she writes, her focus of expertise is on the history of religions. In her classic book, A History of God, and she's not Christian, she wrote, there had been a primitive monotheism, that's belief in one God, before men and women started to worship a number of gods. In the beginning, therefore, there was one God. And so from her anthropological study of human beings, like her conclusion is that in the beginning, before polytheism developed, human beings, to everything they understand, worshipped one God. That aligns totally with the scriptures. So you could say that in the beginning, people worshipped one God, and they had a relationship with the Creator. Now, on the map here, we don't know exactly where the Garden of Eden was, or like there's some approximate thoughts, like it could have been here. And so for the illustration's sake, I'm putting a little geographic region there of like, say that is where the Garden of Eden was, where God created people. And so the story goes that he created people in his image. And you could say he created Adam and Eve, and they were his children. And I've read a theologian who says, and he created children to actually be in the family business together because he was giving them responsibility. And what occurred was, in that sense of their existence, he gave them one command not to do, and that was basically, don't eat from this one tree. And at the same time, God had also created some, to use this word, spiritual angelic beings, and one of them took form of a serpent in this garden, and it was who we know as the devil or Satan, is the titles that developed later. And it even says, like, there was a temptation to basically say, take of this fruit. Don't listen to God, because you want to have more knowledge. And so what occurred was they then disobeyed God and took of this fruit. Now, if you back out and you say, like, what was going on there? It's kind of like they were saying through a tempter that was part of it, I know more than God. He's saying don't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I want to be here on my own terms. I'm going to place myself, like it's not saying it like this, but I'm placing myself, I want to have things my way, and I'm not going to do what God said to do. And when that happened, I've heard different ways of describing this. It was like a nuclear bomb went off because the relationship between human beings and God got damaged severely. What occurred, and today we live in the fallout of that, which is sin. I've also heard it was like a virus that was let loose, and that human beings at that point got infected with the virus of sin. And what sin is in the scriptures, it's saying that we all deal with this every day. It's that we have ego and pride, and we want control. And that's part of our sin nature, as the New Testament describes it. And from the beginning then, that was even part of what said, I want the Garden of Eden this way, even though God says this, I want to do this. And after that, all of us deal with the fallout, the radiation of the nuclear bomb going off, or we deal with like the infection of this sin, like a virus, that we struggle, every person, with, I want to do things my way. And we all do, and God helps us not to do that, but that is there. And when that relationship was damaged, when the children of God rebelled, they were then removed from this garden, the whole relationship changed. But here's what happens, is that God, as a loving Father, saw this, and then he gave them hope right from that moment. When the serpent who was there, that was part of this whole temptation, he's then speaking to the serpent after they rebelled And then he said, I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. And then God says he will crush your head. Someone is going to come to crush this evil that was let into this world. And it says you will strike his heel, but that's not a damaging, it's play out the whole New Testament story. But the point here is God's saying somebody's going to come and you're going to get restored back with what happened here incorrectly. From the moment humans rebelled against God, we then see God promising redemption and a way of forgiveness to come. And what's interesting, it says, he will crush your head. Someone is going to come in the future that's going to restore what happened here. So then time goes on, and we see from that moment, human beings were in a sin-infected, fallout-damaged way of living, and were in a rebellion-oriented posture. And the fallout of this sin-influenced people is that they then began determining their own ways of operating. Slavery started, polygamy, misogyny, creating their own gods and spiritual belief systems then started. Like right after, we then see jealousy with Cain and Abel, and there's murder that takes place. We see polygamy start because men physically are generally, can overpower women. And then all of a sudden, we see women treated more as property. You see polygamy starting. Men can have multiple wives, as many as they wanted. And everything's changing due to human selfishness. Because all of a sudden, we're infected with this kind of virus. Then we see time going on, and then there was another important point in the scriptural story in Genesis chapter 11, where human beings were then saying, we want to control God. And they built this tower, this ziggurat, the Tower of Babel. And when you look into the whole story behind it, it's basically humans saying, we want to control God and invite him down on our terms, is what was going on there. And God says, because we want to make our name great, enough is enough. All right, I'm going to scatter you now. And at that point, humans were spreading across the planet, migrating and spreading. I actually ran this by a UCSC professor, and she said, it's kind of oversimplistic, but it's true how the people migrated here. So I'm showing you this map because then what occurred was, after this spreading out, we then see, say in Egypt, like as human beings went down into Egypt, they started then worshiping, whether it was pharaohs, animals, the sun, the moon. People started creating their own worship systems, however they wanted to, even for pharaohs to be worshipped as God. We see animism, worshiping animals that were another way. We see people that were worshiping, all of a sudden rivers, trees, mountains became deities of worship. As people spread, Hinduism then started with this kind of understanding of God and gods and goddesses. Around 1500 BC is when Hinduism formally started. And time goes on. But as time was going, and as all of these different religions were being started, there was still a faithful group that stayed with one God. And the promises that then God was communicating down was, there's one God. Here's who I am, and I'm telling you about, he was telling him who he was. We then see like Moses, Abraham. The formal, you could say, religion of Judaism started in 1440 BC, but that all along continuing one God, awaiting the promise of someone that was going to come to crush his head and restore things. And then God began to let them know about, through Moses, who wrote the first 5 books of the scriptures, and prophets, God speaking through people, to tell him, don't forget what I promised. It's going to happen one day. And it happened through the lineage of Abraham, through the lineage of David. All of these things were told. And I'm just going to quickly just even show a few snippets. So while all of these other world faiths were being started, there was still a faithful people group that were believing in the one true God. That was still happening. Like when you look at the world timeline of when other faiths happened, worshipers of the one true God was always in existence. So you'll see a prophet in Isaiah, and God started communicating to try to get them prepared for a pinpoint of who this person was going to be. And in Isaiah 7:14, this was around 500 BC to 700 BC. There's some differences of opinion of when exactly this was spoken. But therefore the Lord will give you a sign. A virgin's going to conceive. So this person's going to be from a virgin. In Micah, a prophet, it said the city's going to be Bethlehem, where this person's going to come out of. In Isaiah, again, it gives more description. It says this person's going to be pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that was brought on us peace, was on him. By his wounds we're healed. Then we see it says that God promised that someone was going to come, and the perplexing part was it was going to be some sort of sacrifice that needed to take place. Then what we see is as time goes on, other religions were being birthed. We see Buddhism around 563 BC, Shinto, like these different religions kept popping up because human beings were creating things. And then we see in Isaiah again some very specific things that God was telling these prophets. It was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer, and through the Lord make his life a guilt offering. After that suffering of his soul, he'll see the light of life, because he poured out his life unto death, and he bore the sin of many. And then it's like, all right, in order to have this sin removed, our rebellion against God, our insufficiencies as human beings, when we hurt people and we do things, somehow someone's going to come that'll be the way between us and God to bear our sin. This was hundreds of years before Jesus. Then Jesus comes, and then he goes to the cross. He dies. He's raised again from the dead. And then as we learn, he was the one that was prophesied about way back in the beginning, saying someone's going to crush evil's, the serpent's head. And we see these prophets saying, through him will be forgiven. He's the one way to God, and now he's here, right? And then all of a sudden you read these verses. Like now, here's Dan back in Colorado State reading these verses. Like I didn't know the whole story. So when I'm reading them, like, oh no, how does this make sense? Like, for there's one God and one mediator between God and mankind, right? The man, Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for people. Like, nah, I get it. This is the one that's been talking about for thousands of years here. This is the one that was from the beginning. Of course there's one. In the beginning, it said there's going to be just one. In Acts chapter 4, verse 12, salvation is found in no one else. For there's no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. No wonder this makes sense. This is exactly the story that went along. And always people still believed. Just as other faiths were coming up, as people made up different faiths and said there were different connections to God, and all, there's one faithful group that stayed there. That didn't disappear. And it finally was culminated in Jesus. That's why when you read in John 14:6, Jesus himself, right? This is Jesus himself saying this. Because Jesus, Christians are so divided. They're always, this is what I would have said. They're always like saying like they're the one way. Jesus said this, not just like the church. This is Jesus saying, I am the way. Not I am the way, and Gandhi's the way, and Hinduism's the way. He's like, I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It's just like, oh, now it makes sense. And what happened was, those that were there at that time, the followers of Jesus who put faith in him, understood this. Now, their world back then, they lived in a world, the Greco-Roman world, it was different belief systems. They worshipped multitudes of gods and goddesses. It was polytheistic. You had Jewish folks that were rejecting Jesus as Savior. There's like all these mix of beliefs. And when they realized that Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life, they said, we got to tell people about this, even in a very difficult situation. That's why many of them were jailed. Many of them were killed. because they realize this is true and we got to tell other people there's one way to God because they're believing a whole bunch of things that aren't true. And so you'll see the story of Christians traveling and starting new churches, just like Awakening was started 10 or 11 years ago, to spread the news of who Jesus was. Now, Islam, a guy named Muhammad, had some other sort of prophecy and said, I think this is who God is, and I don't want to shortchange a world religion here, but very quickly, when you hold up the Quran, and I'm just saying this very lovingly, and please let's talk if you don't agree or want to know more, the scriptures stand way much more, and there's so many complex, very difficult things that wouldn't make, I say this with great respect, but that the scriptures stand forth as truth. But other faiths developed. And as these other faiths developed, going all the way back to the beginning, Jesus is the Savior who was prophesied about us, about long before, and even during these other times, people believed. Now, if Anna and the worship team can come on up as I wrap this up here. Because the scriptures clearly say there's only one God in Jude 125. Our Savior, not saviors, through Jesus Christ our Lord. There's only one God, and Jesus is the way to God. And I'm saying this like this isn't divisive. It's not arrogant. It's not judgmental of other faiths to believe that if it's true. In fact, here's my challenge to everybody here. If we believe Jesus is the only way and the truth and the life, it's unloving to keep this amazing one-way truth about God to ourselves. We want to have more people know about this, as many as possible, right? And it's uncomfortable today to say we believe Jesus is the only way. It's uncomfortable because we live in such a diverse thing of belief. But if it's true, right? If it's true, then it should be the most urgent mission we have. And I know that's why this is what this church is about. And to this day, we want others to know that there's one God and the way to him is through Jesus. And we want as many people as possible to know that that's true. And if you're not a believer in here and you're hearing this, I know it's difficult. I didn't know this. But God's Spirit, and this isn't just subjective emotions, leads us to truth. And if it's something that you've been just wondering, it's like I just gave you a whole history of things. It's true. And my life has been changed, and I'm the most skeptical person you probably could think. And Jesus is the only way. And when you lay out those other paths, they don't lead to the same God. So Lord, as we're here, I just thank you for that you revealed to us truth. And you revealed to us who you are and that Jesus is the one Savior. And I do pray for those in this room that are in relationships and maybe it's uncomfortable. But if something is true, please give us the boldness in the right way, in the right time, to share that Jesus is the one way to you.
We're going to continue in a time of worship of the one who came for us, the one who died for us and defeated sin and death and rose again that we might have life. To do that, let's continue in worship, and we're going to partake in communion, the celebration and remembrance of his body broken for us, his blood poured out for us, that we might experience his grace, his salvation, his life, his hope. And just encourage you as we worship, if you just need to take some time and just allow that reality, that truth to settle, and do so. And we practice an open table here, so if you're a follower of Jesus, please come forward to the front or in the back if you're gluten-free. And let's remember the one who came for us.